We'll talk about spasticity as it is very important in case of the upper motor neuron syndrome. I will make some introduction and then we'll get with the video that I found, that I suppose it's quite nice. So, spasticity and spinal cord injury by SCIRE. You can find it on YouTube as usually, and it is a good idea to like this video of this, of course, this SCIRE. But first of all, some introduction. As you know, generalized spasticity is connected with increased muscle tension. What is the source of this muscle tension? At the moment. So what is the source of the muscle tension? You already remember the stretch reflex, yes? So the stretch reflex is about getting the information through the nerves from the brain into the spinal cord, and from the spinal cord to the muscle. From the muscle to the spinal cord, and from the spinal cord to the muscle. So this is a loop. How does this loop works? One more time. This works generally by getting information from the muscle. So when the muscle is stretched, it passes the information to the spinal cord, and then spinal cords gets back the information for the same muscle to contract. So the same is happening in case of spasticity. But in case of the spasticity, this process is highly exaggerated. So any elongation of the muscle will lead to its contraction. In normal cases, in our cases for example, it is beneficial because it leads to the smooth movement. It leads to maintaining some muscle tension that is needed for effective moving. But in case of when it's exaggerated, it leads to huge problems. It leads to the situations that any stretching of the muscles will lead to muscle contraction, and very strong muscle contraction. So imagine it, yes? Imagine that you have a spasticity in the biceps, yes? I'm usually giving the example of the biceps and triceps because these are just generally very simple to understand, yes? So imagine that you have a spasticity in the biceps. Usually, of course, you have a spasticity in big groups of muscles, not only in one, but just for now, that we have this in biceps. Let's say that this is the elbow. We have the spasticity here, yes, in this muscle. And you try to extend your elbow. What happens? You stretch this. You stretch the biceps. So it obviously would activate the stretch reflex. In normal situations, yes, it would be just slight, just to keep the tension. But in case of the spasticity, it would be very strong. It would invoke very strong muscle contraction. So what would happen? It would be extremely hard to invoke any movement. It would be extremely hard to extend the muscle, to extend the elbow, yes, to elongate the muscle. The same would be anywhere, yes. So the same may be, for example, with fingers, yes. So if we have spasticity of the finger, yes, when it's flexed, we cannot elongate it because any elongation will lead to activation of the stretch reflex and contraction. But we have also something called clasp knife phenomenon. Clasp knife phenomenon is connected with the Golgi receptors. So getting back to the example of the elbow. As you remember, the Golgi receptors are activating when we have high power output, yes? So generally, if we add a lot of force, the Golgi receptors would be activated and the muscle tension in the same muscle would be greatly reduced. It is also acting here. So generally, we will get first very heavy, very strong muscle tension because of the response from the stretch reflex, and then this muscle tension would reduce because of activation of the Golgi receptors. So we'll pull. First, it would really inhibit any movement of the muscle, and then it would just drop down nearly to zero. Yes, so this is called clasp knife phenomenon, because first of all, the stretch reflex is activated, and then reflex from the Golgi receptors is activated. So first the muscle tension is very big, and then it drops rapidly, and this is called the clasp knife phenomenon. This is a general idea. How does it look? So generally, the spasticity is also better visible when we try to stretch the muscle fast, because this will more effectively stretch the muscle. Yes, so when we try to extend hand fast, extend the elbow fast, it will more effectively stretch the muscle, so it will more effectively activate the stretch reflex generally. And obviously it's length dependent. So the more we are trying to stretch the muscle, the harder it is to move it further, generally speaking. Okay, but it's not always true in all of the muscles, but at least in some there is. This is a bit more complex. However, this is some idea that you need to keep. Do not get it blindly that in every muscle is the same. So I mean that not in every muscle the spasticity is stronger when the muscle is short and then smaller when it's elongated, but it may happen, and I suppose it's easy to understand why it is happening like that. Okay, so what are other important phenomena that are affecting and trying and are important in the pathophysiology of spasticity? We have also some how to say it? Oh, maybe let's start from different point. Why those reflexes are exaggerated? Why the stretch reflex and reflex from the Golgi apparatus also to some extent is exaggerated? Why the threshold for those reflexes are smaller? Because there is an uninhibition of the spinal cord. What is the upper motor neuron syndrome? Upper motor neuron syndrome is generally when the brain loses any control over the spinal cord and the muscles. So the brain does not hold any power over the spinal cord and the muscle. Yes? This leads to the situation that the spinal cord do what wants. So the only thing that the spinal cord knows what to do are a couple of the reflexes, like the reflex from the Golgi apparatus and the reflex from the stretch reflex. So if it's the only thing that it knows how to do, it does it in all the time. Yes, and it's so much exaggerated. This is a general idea. So any inhibitory influence from the brain is just stopped. All of the input from the brain is stopped, but we have mostly the inhibitory inputs if we are thinking about the stretch reflex, for example. Okay, so this is a general idea. The other important thing about spasticity that I want to note now before we get to the video is that it will also lead to pain. Spastic muscles can lead to pain in many mechanisms, and generally there are no good treatments for this. The best treatment for spasticity, for many reasons, is movement. Why movement is the best? Because when you stretch it, you are preventing complications. So first of all, you are also training the spinal cord that the stretch reflex could be a bit too exaggerated, for example. Of course, it's a bit of the simplification, but it helps, yes? Stretching of the muscles is helping. Other thing is that when the muscle is stretched for a long periods of time and it's not moved, so nobody stretches it, so it's contracted, sorry, and nobody stretches it, a lot of connective tissue would develop, yes? And if this connective tissue would develop, it's like a scar. So it's extremely hard later to move this muscle, yes, because it works as a scar. You can elongate the muscle, but you cannot elongate effectively a scar. So movement will reduce the risk of this proliferation of the connective tissue and will reduce the contractures. So generally, the best, nearly the only, maybe not the only, but nearly the only, the best treatment for the spasticity is movement. Okay, and let's go to the video that we have.
The definition of spasticity has evolved over time. More recently, clinicians are describing spasticity as a sensory motor disorder as a result of a lesion to the upper motor neuron system, so the brain or the spinal cord, characterized by intermittent involuntary muscle activation. What typically happens is that after an injury, individuals with spinal cord injury are in a spinal shock, so they have no reflexes and no spasticity at first.
So this is important, yes? This spinal shock is also explaining the strange thing that the negative upper motor neuron syndrome signs and positive are completely different, and generally it is impossible in most cases to have both at one time, yes, because these negative are mostly present in this first phase of the spinal shock, for example, because this is the only one possibility. We have a lot of different pathologies that will lead to the upper motor neuron syndrome. Here we are talking about spasticity after the spinal cord injury. Yes, this is just one of the examples. But generally, we have the negative signs, negative upper motor neuron syndrome signs just after the pathology happened. Yes, we have this spinal shock when the spinal cord did not have time to go rampant. Yes, did not have time to activate so much to get all of those reflexes exaggerated.
As the spinal shock resolves and as changes in the spinal cord occur, the spasticity can emerge. Not everyone gets it, but approximately 80% of individuals with spinal cord injury will. At first, it may be quite mild and perceived as non-problematic. And in some individuals, that will progress and become more severe in its intensity and frequency, and it can become problematic.
Sometimes you can feel it coming, like a twitch, kind of like a sneeze, you can feel it coming. Mm-hmm. You know, other times it just comes on sudden. At the moment, it is a huge problem. The pain and the tightness, the tone is there all the time. But with some of the drugs, it relieves it and just allows me to do, other things. At times, the tone is beneficial, when it helps me, stand up, I guess. But trying to find a balance.
Individuals with spinal cord injury can experience spasticity, and that can be problematic or not problematic. The way that we think about non-problematic spasticity is if it either doesn't cause problems with pain or skin breakdowns, it can be helpful. So if you have an area of weakness that has muscle spasms, you can activate those spasms in order to help with things like positioning or transfers and sometimes even walking.
The
spasticity for me is being the biggest inhibitor from actually getting ambulatory again. It's been ongoing for about 9 months now. The issue for me is to actually get into the parallel bars where I've been trying to walk. With my right leg, particularly, the spasticity comes on, and I'm unable to load that leg to take a stride and continue forward in a walking pattern. So when I first started dealing with this as an issue, it was impossible to get upright for any length of time before the spasticity kicked in, and I really had to return to sitting position or de-weight off the right leg.
Lead to skin breakdown because of the frequent spasms causing rubbing against surfaces. It can also cause problems with function, either passive function or active function. Another area that it can affect is general quality of life and participation. And one other thing is cosmesis, so if it interferes with your perception of yourself. So when you're asking an individual whether or not their spasticity is problematic, they may ask you, what do you mean by that? And that's one way to think about categorizing problematic spasticity that I find useful.
Okay, thank you.